Trading at Schwab is now powered by Ameritrade, giving you even more specialized support than ever before. Like access to the trade desk, our team of passionate traders ready to tackle anything from the most complex trading questions to a simple strategy gut check. Need assistance? No problem. Get 24/7 professional answers and live help, and access support by phone, email, and in-platform chat. That's how Schwab is here for you, to help you trade brilliantly. Learn more at schwab.com/trading.
It was the last day of school, and 9-year-old Scott from St. Charles, Missouri was ready to dive into summer. He started the season like so many other kids, riding his bike and exploring a nearby wooded area popular with local children. But in a single moment, Scott vanished. That same afternoon, a powerful thunderstorm swept through the area, triggering flash floods. At first, many believed he may have been caught in the rising waters, prompting an urgent and widespread search. But when no trace of him was found in those early days, investigators began to suspect something far more sinister. Over the years, Scott's case has taken many turns, through rumors, leads, and dead ends. But one thing has never surfaced: the truth about what happened to him on that day. And a new task force formed just this year is hoping to change that. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved disappearance of Scott Allen Kleeschulte. Nestled along the banks of the Missouri River just northwest of St. Louis sits the city of St. Charles, Missouri. Known for its cobblestone streets and preserved colonial architecture, it was the original capital of Missouri and a key stop on the Lewis and Clark expedition. The area experienced a bit of growth in the 1980s, going from around 37,000 residents in 1980 to around 55,000 by 1990. And during that time, St. Charles firmly established itself as a safe, middle-class suburb, drawing in families from nearby St. Louis. The city was home to quiet neighborhoods, public schools, churches, parks, an ideal setting for raising children. One such family raising their children there was the Kleeschulte family. Richard and Peggy both worked at First Capital Printing in St. Charles, and together they had 5 children. Tim, age 19 and engaged to be married, Stacy, 17, Richie, 12, Scott, 9, and Tammy, age 6. The family lived in a working-class subdivision on Leverance Drive. Just beyond the sprawling neighborhood filled with mostly ranch-style homes was a stretch of land that had been long a playground for local kids. It was a wooded area dotted with creek beds, hills, and makeshift caves, an untamed spot right next to the Norfolk and Western Railroad tracks. Children spent countless hours there, riding their bikes over the hills, building forts, and carving out tunnels. Locals had a name for it. Passed down over the years, they simply called it the trails. And just to give you an idea of size, the general area was about 30 acres, and it consisted of woods, cliffs, and ravines, so you did have to be careful. The Kleeschulte's 9-year-old son Scott spent most of his free time there. He had many friends in the neighborhood, and so they would ride their bikes together, play games in the woods, and explore the caves in the area. I had to read up on this area quite a bit to really understand it, so I looked at old newspaper photos, and I really tried to get a sense of the space because it's so unique. Basically, over 2 decades, kids in this neighborhood had dug this labyrinth kind of style tunnels along this dirt hillside, and it connected into the woods. The main cave could fit as many as 5 adults in it, and the depth of this labyrinth was as far as 30 to 40 feet deep into the hillside. So it would have these little paths off of it, and you could get lost. Apparently, it could get very confusing to navigate. And so for like little kids, it could get really scary, but Scott knew them well. On Wednesday, June 8th, 1988, Scott was watching some cartoons before school. He said goodbye to his parents, and they had been elated for Scott that morning because he had some learning difficulties and he had to repeat grades. But this was his last day of first grade. He was so proud of himself. He had passed everything, and they told him to have a great day at school, and that after they got home from work that night, they'd get him some new shoes and they'd all go out to dinner to celebrate. Scott got home at around 3:30 p.m. on that afternoon. He grabbed a snack, got changed into his play clothes, and headed out on his bike. Some accounts say he was seen in his neighborhood with his friend Mike for a while, but then he went off to play on his own. His last confirmed sighting was by his sister Stacy, who reported seeing her brother on a hillside area around Ken Drive and West Adams Street. A couple of sources also talk about him being seen around Elm Point Road and Elm Street. Have no fear, I have a million maps for you guys on my Instagram this week at SimplerTimeCrimePod. But if you want to have better context just while listening, Ken and West Adams is within his subdivision, whereas Elm Point Road and Elm Street is just outside where the trails are. Shortly after Stacy saw Scott, an unexpected thunderstorm ripped through the area. Well, maybe the storm wasn't completely unexpected, but at least the severity of it was, and it actually caused significant flash flooding. Around this area was not only major rivers, but multiple streams, creeks, and other smaller waterways, so it became dangerous in inclement weather, and this was a common problem. Scott was known to not like rainy weather, so his family was surprised when he wasn't home when the storm really took off. But initially, they didn't freak out. They know that Scott knows people in the neighborhood and thought that maybe he was caught in the rain and he stopped in for shelter somewhere. This wasn't unheard of. He had disappeared for a few hours before. It's just that he would usually phone home and say where he was and update his folks. But he didn't call to check in, and he didn't return home. And by 8:30, their dinner plans had come and gone, and the family was getting really worried. The family decided to go door to door, and around the common neighborhood outdoor areas he played in, they did their own makeshift canvas to look for him, and when they couldn't locate him, they quickly called police. That first evening was kind of rough because it was already getting dark out, so they could not find him whatsoever. They couldn't find any clues, but by morning, a full search took place. Knowing the unique landscape, authorities knew they were in for a difficult search, but they had no idea how complex that cave system was. All day on Thursday, in addition to 25 on-duty police officers, there were 40 civilian volunteers and off-duty police officers searching the wooded hillside for the boy, as well as current police academy members. They went along the railroad tracks, they went into the caves, they went into the creek beds, and also they went door to door, just as the Kleeschulte family had done the evening before. Additional officers searched on ATV, and some of them went out on horseback. But there were no signs of Scott. No footprints, no clothing, no bike, no Scott. Officers looked into drainage areas and large culverts. They were concerned that perhaps Scott had tried to take shelter in one during the storm and that water had swept him up and out into the Mississippi River. And you might be saying, Megan, do you mean the Missouri River? But no, I looked into this, and the St. Charles area lies within the Mississippi River watershed, which is one of the largest in North America. And this means that all the runoff from rain, creeks, ditches, and culverts in the area, it's designed to eventually flow into the major rivers like the Mississippi or Missouri. But in this particular area, it flowed into the Mississippi. But police couldn't bank on that, so they continued their comprehensive search, and they even brought in some infrared equipment to search the pipes and tunnels. They also brought in helicopters and bloodhounds. The dogs traced Scott's scent from his home to the nearby woods, but the problem is Scott went in there all the time, so it was really hard to say if it was from that particular day. This scent was lost at Fox Hill Road, where the current Fox Hill apartments are located, and the apartments were under construction at that time. So all day Thursday this went on, all day Friday, but by 8:30 p.m. on Friday, the official search was called off. This didn't mean that they wouldn't search in any area based on a tip, but they were calling off the formal search. They just couldn't find Scott out there, And while they hadn't come right out and said it, police were beginning to think there was something more ominous going on. They did not believe that Scott had gotten swept up in the rain or injured in the woods. They felt something more sinister was at play. Despite their heartache, the Kleeschulte family was doing their best to hang in there, and they were so appreciative of their local community. Even though the official search was off, additional volunteers spent the weekend scouring the woods and the hillside and the creek beds even further. The community continued to believe that maybe Scott had been taken away in the floodwaters. While tragic, it allowed the idea that a monster hadn't infiltrated their close-knit neighborhood and stolen a child off the street in broad daylight. Conversely, the Kleeschulte family was thinking and actually hoping the opposite. 42-year-old Richard told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, quote, "There's been no footprints, no clothing found. If he's abducted, at least there's a chance that they might let him go," end quote. That's just heartbreaking to me to think that this family had to lean into the idea that abduction was a better option, because if he had been swept away in the floodwaters and hadn't made any contact with anybody at this point, they would have to assume he is dead and he is drowned. But they're thinking in this one, yes, he could be scared. Yes, he could be held captive. Yes, terrible things could be happening, but at least he's still alive and at least there's still a chance. And that's just devastating to think about. The neighborhood held a vigil for Scott's safe return. The Kleeschultes had lived in the neighborhood for around 17 years, and everyone was used to seeing sweet Scott riding around on his bike with his cute smile and missing teeth. Richard went on to say that Scott was a very normal and typical boy. He was easygoing, he loved to eat and watch TV, he was active, he loved sports, and he liked to play around the creek areas. And he usually would go there with friends. He was also big into football. As the 1 week mark approached with no signs of Scott, the community once again rallied. Private donors and companies pulled together a $10,000 reward for information on Scott's whereabouts. On that same day, police contracted with locals to bring in bulldozers to tear down the caves. Once they got in there, they couldn't believe it. Not only just how intricate they were, but how risky. One man said, quote, "I can't believe someone hasn't been crushed in a cave-in down there. The dirt is so loose you can dig it with a spoon. They don't realize how dangerous it is," end quote. One local mother told the paper that her boys used to go in there and that all the area boys would go in and play G.I. Joe, but that it made her nervous and she knew it was dangerous. After this day, the bulldozer effectively destroyed the tunnel system and ended an outdoor generational hand-me-down play space, which sounds like it was for the best. As the weeks went on, the Kleeschultes continued to be embraced by their community. 2 young girls held a lemonade stand in the neighborhood, and they hand-delivered a $26.26 reward over to the family to aid in the search, which is just the sweetest. Meals were delivered along with cards and, of course, prayers. Scott's football team was allowed to have a 22-person roster, and his coach, who was very active in the search immediately and ongoing, said that he would only field 21 players, leaving Scott's spot open for him for when he was found. The coach, a man named Dallas Ferber, consulted with a psychic to try to get leads, and he actually took out his personal canoe into nearby waterways on at least 4 different occasions, looking for any sign of Scott that other searchers may have missed. But after this, things quieted down for a bit. Then, at the end of July 1988, searchers and investigators conducted another targeted dig. A lot happened in those 6 weeks. Father's Day came and passed without Scott's return. Scott's older brother turned 20. Peggy's 40th birthday was coming up the next week. Scott's brother Richie was set to start football without him and was really struggling with that. His little sister was eager for her brother's return, and she said she couldn't practice for her part in her older brother's upcoming wedding because she needed her brother there with her. Police revealed that around July 4th, a woman reported hearing a little boy saying, "Help me," around the caves, but investigators searched again and couldn't substantiate any of this. They took leads from psychics, But John P. Zumwalt, the chief of the Detective Bureau, said, quote, "My personal opinion of psychics is they aren't any good unless they can win the lottery 2 weeks in a row," end quote. At that 6-week mark, most people felt that Scott was not in those woods. However, they were so overgrown that some searchers felt you could miss a body, especially a small one of a 9-year-old, unless it was right in front of you. So searchers went back in and searched more locations in more depth from the direction of psychics. For the Kleeschultes, the worst case scenario was that he was dead out there in a place they had already searched and that they had just missed him. They held out hope that he had been kidnapped and was kept alive, and that the abductor would get scared and return him or make some sort of mistake. Peggy Kleeschulte talked about how her kids had adapted their behavior and become more communicative. She said, quote, "My kids never leave now without telling me exactly where they're going. I don't have to say anything," end quote. In October of '88, a flyer with Scott's face was mailed to 50 million households in America, sponsored by Advo System, Inc., the nation's largest direct mail company. This was in conjunction with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Also in that month, his face was featured on the Oprah Winfrey Show in a segment about missing children. This generated a call from Dallas, Texas. A woman called and said Scott's picture strongly resembled a boy who had just moved into her neighborhood. Police let the Kleeschultes know about this potential lead, and they were looking into it, and the Kleeschultes got their hopes up. But just as quickly, their hearts sank. The little boy was not Scott. Ever optimistic, the Kleeschulte patriarch told the news that another lead would turn up, that they'd find out something, and that they hadn't given up hope as a family. In November of '88, Scott's oldest brother got married, and by Christmas they found out they were expecting their first child. His brother and new wife discussed naming the baby Scott if it were a boy, which was bittersweet and emotional for the family. The first Christmas, Peggy Kleeschulte couldn't bear to do anything the way it was when Scott was there. She said Christmas shopping was so difficult because she kept seeing toys and gifts that she knew he would love. They always had an artificial tree, but she just felt moved to get a real tree this year and put completely new decorations on it. She told the paper, quote, "We take each day as it comes. It's all you can do. Sometimes the strangest thing, maybe something that happens at work, will remind me of Scotty and set me off." Her husband said that he kept busy coaching Richie's football team, and that was 3 nights a week, so that kept him busy along with work. But he said, quote, "I still wake up every night thinking about him, and I haven't given up hope." One other thing I want to add right here, because there's really no great place to put it from a timeline perspective, because it's one of those things that comes out later and not at this time, but I don't want to bury the lead. It would later come out by police that another neighbor actually saw Scott jumping in rain puddles after the storm. So that effectively pretty much eliminated the flash flood, and they seem to really believe this neighbor, and that this neighbor saw him near Ken Drive. It just, again, it makes that storm scenario improbable, but that still lingers to this day. And so I share this here just to shift your perspective, if it does. 1988 turned into 1989, and the 1-year anniversary had very few new leads. A fisherman actually found a human skull in a nearby lake, but this was quickly ruled out as Scott as it was an adult skull. It wouldn't be until 1999, when history seemed to be repeating itself, that police would get their next lead in Scott's case, and the community would be left in total panic. On the evening of August 14th, 1990, 7-year-old Todd T.J. Pig Jr. and 8-year-old Benjamin C. Hurt were riding their bicycles in a wooded area near Briarcliff Drive and Elm Street in St. Charles. When the boys didn't arrive home, their families grew worried. Just for a clear picture, the boys lived in the same neighborhood and played in the same hillside area as Scott Kleeschulte. Even though the caves and tunnels were mostly destroyed at this point, kids still played in and out of the woods and rode their bikes. Concern grew when their bikes were found abandoned, but the boys were nowhere to be found. Police and search parties took over, immediately thinking of Scott Kleeschulte and suddenly wondering if there was more to his disappearance than the storm. And that went into overdrive with a horrific discovery. At around 11 p.m. that same evening, both little boys were found dead. Just as a quick trigger warning, these next couple of minutes, I'm going to share some graphic details, including sexual abuse against a child. The boys had been strangled with their own shoelaces. They were sexually assaulted and left naked out in the woods. And the area where their body was found, near Elm Street, near the railroad tracks, the exact area Scotty was last seen nearby. The families in the neighborhood were at an all-time panic. It was clear to them that a sexual predator was in their midst, and that Scott Kleeschulte was the victim of the same perpetrator as Todd and Benjamin. Todd, who as I mentioned went by TJ, his stepfather said he had just told the boys not to ride their bikes in the area. He said he just had this sense that sexual predators knew where kids all hung out and that it was like a hunting ground for them. Other parents said they were no longer letting their kids play unattended and that their children's innocence was shattered. But nothing could prepare the community for what answers would come next. You see, just a little more than a week later, police announced the arrest of 2 minors, a 10 and 13-year-old. The 13-year-old being the perpetrator of the crime and the 10-year-old for hindering the investigation. Because they were minors, their records were sealed, and Missouri law stated that because they were under 14, they couldn't be tried as adults. But the media was able to get a hold of the 13-year-old's name. I won't use his name here. I'm just going to call him Z. But I will tell you who he was. He was the older brother of Benjamin Hurt. Yes, you heard that right. Benjamin's own brother sexually assaulted and murdered him and his 7-year-old friend. Later information would come out that Z had engaged in bizarre sexual endeavors that I don't really want to go too far into here, but I've linked articles that do tell more detail. It's just not necessary for the story here. Suddenly, the community didn't know what to think. Not only were they all shocked, it would be crazy to wrap your head around that no matter what, but Z was known to be a favorite of neighborhood moms. He was polite, he was a rule follower, he delivered flowers for Mother's Day. It was honestly nuts, but also they felt there was no way, despite being in the exact area as Scott's abduction, that it could be related. Z would have been just 10 years old back in June of '88, and it seemed unlikely he'd be able to pull that crime off. Not only that, but Scott's body was not found, something Z didn't try to hide with his brother and TJ. So as crazy as all that is, it seemed unconnected to the authorities, and so they had to move on when it came to Scott's case. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for tuning in, thank you for your support, and thank you for adjusting, because if you've been listening to me all along, I know this is your first week encountering ads. I've been holding off forever on doing them, but I'm trying to do some big things with the podcast, and I really need to be able to financially support the work I'm putting forth. So I appreciate you all sticking with me. And just as a reminder, follow me on social media platforms and feel free to send case suggestions to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. The next potential case would come in 1991, and it was the disappearance of 11-year-old Arlen Henderson. Arlen lived in Moscow Mills, Missouri, a little over 30 miles northwest of St. Charles. It was July 25th, 1991, when Arlen set out for a bike ride near his home in Moscow Mills, Missouri. He never came back. Days later, the FBI got involved, and in October, Arlen's bike was found abandoned in a nearby bean field. There were fingerprints on it, but no match and no sign of Arlen. Rather than keep this in perfect chronological order with Scott's case, I'm going to jump ahead and just give you what we know about Arlen's case, high-level overview, because his is also still unsolved. Arlen was last seen between 5 and 5:30 p.m. riding his white and yellow bicycle. For months, there was no sign of him, and then, as I mentioned, 3 months after he disappeared, Arlen's bike was found in the bean field off North Islin Road, roughly 5 miles from his home. They couldn't connect those fingerprints. They were hoping, though, that it might lead to a break in the case, but it didn't. 10 years later, in 2001, a man named Joshua Spangler came forward and confessed to Arlen's murder. At the time of the alleged crime, Spangler would have just been 13 years old. So again, you have someone who is a minor that's confessing to this very serious crime. He claimed he had been involved in the drug scene, and he associated with a couple of really dangerous men. Their names were George and Charles, or Chucky Gibson, and he said they paid him $10,000 to kill Arlen as a warning over an unpaid drug debt related to his family, not the little kid himself. Spangler told police that he and George Gibson abducted Arlen, held him for a few days in Davis, Missouri, and then claimed to have shot him in a creek bed and buried his body near the Mississippi River. Authorities actually took this confession very seriously, and they even filed charges against the Gibson brothers. Searches were conducted all over in that area near Winfield, Missouri, but they couldn't find his remains. And then the story unraveled. Investigators discovered major inconsistencies, and Spangler ultimately admitted that he made the whole thing up. The charges against the Gibsons were dropped, and Spangler was sentenced to 7 years in prison for perjury. Authorities now believe that he fabricated the story as a joke meant to embarrass law enforcement. Even though this turned out to be a false confession, some investigators involved with his investigation they wonder, was Arlen's disappearance tied to drugs at all? But his mother has always strongly denied that anyone in their family was involved in that world, and she actually still lives in the same trailer park, at least that's what I could find, just a different home. Her husband, Arlen's father, had actually died a year before he went missing from emphysema, and she actually kept his name in the phone book just in case Arlen ever tried to call home. One other lead that came with Arlen's case was that his older sister, Joy Henderson Leonard, and her husband, Bob Leonard, might have had some information on the case. They found that out tragically, though, in 2001. Just as investigators were ramping up their efforts, Joy was actually murdered by Robert, who then took his own life. It wasn't until after their deaths that police discovered that they had made statements suggesting they knew more than they had ever shared. So it does make you go, I'm not accusing them of anything to do with drugs, but it's just interesting. It sounds like there is something that they potentially could have known, but we don't know for sure. So Arlen's case is very complicated and convoluted. It's very difficult, but I wanted to mention it just because of the proximity and the similarities. Many people believe Arlen's case and Scott's case, that they're connected, that the same perpetrator is responsible. But I understand that you probably can't get a huge takeaway about Arlen's case just from that little snapshot I gave you. So I encourage you to go listen to one of the podcasts that have covered it in depth and decide for yourself. So Arlen's case was 1991, and in 1992, we'll pick back up with Scott's timeline here. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch published an article with the chilling title, "Woods That Lured St. Charles Boys Will Be Leveled." And that means exactly what you think. After Scott's disappearance and the brutal murders of T.J. Pig Jr. and Benjamin Hurt, the community had pushed for the woods to be cut down and used for new developments, and that's just what happened. A highway was extended for ease of traffic, and so the area that held so many memories wrapped in grief and secrets and unanswered questions was suddenly gone. The years went on with no answers, and in 1997, NCMEC issued an age-progressed photo of Scott, which I'll have on the Instagram. In 2005, another child disappeared that some believe could be connected to Scott's case. 30 miles north of St. Charles is Foley, Missouri, and on March 10, 2005, 13-year-old Bianca Piper disappeared there. Bianca had been struggling with her mental health and was receiving treatment for bipolar disorder. That day, her mother drove her about a mile from their house and let her out of the car to walk the rest of the way home, something she had done one other time before as a calming exercise on the recommendation of her therapist. On this day, they were arguing, and Bianca asked her mother to drive her away from the house so she could do that walking exercise again. Bianca was last seen walking along McIntosh Hill Road, and she never made it home. She was reported missing that evening, and an immediate search was launched. Despite extensive efforts, including ground searches, helicopters, dive teams, canine units, no trace of Bianca has ever been found. She had no history of running away, and her case quickly raised red flags for foul play. Her case is still cold, and a podcast I thought did a really nice job with the full details of her case is one called And Then They Were Gone podcast, so check that out if you want to know more about her full case. But perhaps the biggest lead in Scott's case would come in 2007, when another little boy went missing, and not only was he found, but so was another boy who had been missing for years. On October 6, 2002, 11-year-old Sean Hornbeck left his home in Richwoods, Missouri to ride his bike to a friend's house. Somewhere along the way, he vanished. His bike was later found in a wooded area, but there were no signs of Sean. The small, rural town was stunned. As time passed, hope faded for many, but not for Sean's parents, who never stopped searching. They appeared on national talk shows, they launched a foundation in his name, and they hung on to the possibility that Sean might still be alive. Fast forward to January 8th, 2007, more than 4 years later, when 13-year-old Ben Ownby got off his school bus in the town of Beaufort, Missouri, and never made it home. A witness, another teen who was absolutely a hero in this story, had seen a white pickup truck speeding away from the area where Ben had been seen, and he gave police a partial description of what he remembered. That small lead was enough to spark an intense investigation. Just 4 days later, authorities traced the truck to an apartment complex in Kirkwood, a suburb of St. Louis. When they arrived, they were at the apartment of 41-year-old Michael J. Devlin, and they found Ben Ownby alive. And to everyone's shock, they also found Sean Hornbeck. He had been missing for 1,564 days. Devlin had abducted Sean at gunpoint and kept him in prison for years, often posing as Sean's father or guardian. He allowed Sean limited freedoms like playing video games, walking around in the neighborhood, and even using the internet, but always under a cloud of fear and control. Neighbors and acquaintances had no idea the boy living with Devlin was actually a long missing child. The rescue of both boys made national headlines, and it was hailed as a miracle. And for many families with missing children, it renewed hope that their own loved ones might still be out there. And in Missouri, it inevitably raised questions. If Devlin could hide one child for 4 years, could he have been responsible for others? Investigators looked into potential links between Devlin and unsolved cases, including that of Scott Kleeschulte. Scott had gone missing from St. Charles in 1988, not far from where Devlin lived and operated at various times. In fact, Devlin had allegedly hunted in the woods that all of those kids were known to play in Scott's neighborhood. In 1988, he would have been in his early 20s. In response to all of this, the FBI, Missouri State Highway Patrol, and local law enforcement agencies formed what became known as the Michael J. Devlin Task Force. Its purpose was to re-examine long-standing missing persons cases, especially unsolved child abductions across Missouri and the surrounding states, to determine whether or not Devlin might be connected to any of them. The task force reviewed dozens of cold cases, including some that dated back to the 80s. Investigators looked at the timeline of Devlin's movements, where he lived, where he worked, whether he could have had access to children who went missing. They also analyzed similarities in victim profiles, what the abduction methods were, and geographic proximity. In some cases, they revisited crime scenes and they re-interviewed witnesses, and they also combed through Devlin's digital devices, hoping for evidence or photos that might link him to crimes. But to everyone's disappointment, they couldn't find anything connecting Devlin to other disappearances. And that was very much quickly disbanded. They never even told the families that they were completely abandoning the task force. They just shut it down after 6 months. Many people very much still believe that Scott was the first or one of the first Devlin victims. Much of what has happened since then has been red herrings that give the family a false sense of hope and then turn into nothing. In 2013, a jailhouse informant came forward saying that his cellmate was responsible for Scott's abduction and murder, but this all turned out to be a giant waste of time and false lead. And then in 2016, things blew up on none other than Reddit. Huge shout out to Redditor Topgolf UFO and podcast host of Compulsion Podcast for helping me to summarize this next part with his great write-up. It all began with a Reddit post from January of 2016. Someone had posed a chilling question on the Ask Reddit forum, and they said, to those who've accidentally killed someone, what went wrong? And one of the top voted replies was this one that said the following: "This still haunts me to this day. As kids, we had a hideout in this dirt cliff/cove. This is the best approximation I can find on Google, only 3 times taller and probably 10 times as wide. There was a neighborhood kid who, in hindsight, was probably mentally handicapped in some way, but to us, he was just a weird or creepy kid. This was the 80s, and we weren't exactly raised PC. 3 of us headed out to our base and found creepy kid sitting on top in our guard chair. We yelled at him to get out, and he said something like, 'make me,' and started lobbing dirt clods and sticks down at us. We all ran around to the side to make our way up. It gets pretty fuzzy here, but all I remember is he fell. I still remember the sound. When we got back down to check on him, he was in a very awkward position with blood coming out of his mouth. We all just freaked out and ran home. And if I remember correctly, no one has spoken a word of this to anyone. Or, I'm sorry, it said as far as I know, not if I remember correctly, but you get the idea. We didn't go back for over a month and never said a word between any of us. Again, this was in the 80s, so media wasn't like it is today. Chances are it got a small article in the newspaper B section, missing disabled child found dead after fall or something like that. And that was the end of the Reddit post. Well, of course, the comment section was filled with people saying all sorts of questions, and the Redditor, the original poster, said, "I didn't expect to wake up to all this. I have no idea why we didn't collectively tell our parents. We just booked it for our respective homes without saying a word. It was mainly because he was the weird kid, and we thought we'd get in trouble somehow." And then he went on to say, "I don't think we were directly responsible. Indirect maybe. Again, it's fuzzy. I just remember us throwing sticks at each other. I've tried to find any record of him to no avail. I remember the neighborhood kids from those days, first names, but not last. I have since moved to a few hundred miles away and didn't keep in touch. I don't even remember the kid's first name. I've looked blindly for any record of the kid and have spent hours on Facebook trying to find my old friends, but haven't found anything yet." The Redditor went on to say, "I don't know if he actually died that day. All I have to go on is my mom mentioning him going missing and us not seeing him after that. When we finally went back to our base a month later, there was nothing out of the ordinary, no police tape, anything like that. I don't remember any cops canvassing the area." So this was like as much as that Redditor said, and it of course fueled speculation. There was all sorts of stuff on there, and I'm trying to wrap this up because it really went crazy. They essentially, one of these Redditors who had paid attention, we don't know exactly how, but they decided to investigate. I don't know if they used the poster's Reddit history or traced an IP address, but they really sleuthed and they were able to figure out who this Redditor was, or allegedly, and their approximate age, and they kind of doxed them. They didn't say their exact information, but they really did give quite a bit of information out there. And they said that the person had likely grown up in St. Louis, Missouri. And this was based in part because of a TV show that the poster referenced that had only aired on St. Louis Public Radio from 85 to 91. After this Redditor determined who this person was, then they determined it must be Scott Kleeschulte that they're talking about. And this investigator person, I shouldn't say investigator, this Redditor turned sleuther, actually kind of confronted the original poster and said, like, you would have been 10 or 11 at the time. He was 9. You were in this area. And so it gained a bunch of traction across Reddit and beyond, and it kind of went viral, spreading to other subreddits. YouTubers picked it up, crime blogs picked it up. And the guy who made the connection went on further to say, I'm the one who made the comment regarding Scott Kleeschulte. I won't say too much about who I've alerted about this. It's a disturbing situation. The guy needs to speak with law enforcement right now. I sent them much more info about this guy. They should be able to ID him. But a lot of the information didn't match. For one, the original poster on Reddit who talked about this traumatic situation, they never mentioned the torrential rainstorm that day that struck St. Charles, which that is a big detail in this case. We also know that Scott was held back in school, but there's nothing that says he had actual support needs outside of that. Just they had a learning support need, but nothing that says he has a disability like this was describing. And no media coverage actually referred to him that way. Still, despite the details not adding up, Reddit really snowballed with this. They went in, there was posts everywhere. Things like Redditor confesses to killing childhood Pale. Other Redditors investigate and confirm it's true. Just these really crazy headlines. And unfortunately, what was pointed out is that now when people Google Scott Kleeschulte's name, many of the top results are linked to that Reddit thread and this whole thing that came out in 2016. And it's an inaccurate theory because none of it really matches up. Really, what's thought is that whoever this Redditor was just sort of getting their little claim to fame and they were making it up. Law enforcement hasn't publicly responded to the Reddit claims. There's no confirmation that they investigated the tip, or if they ruled it out, they may have. But unfortunately, the story kind of took a life of its own, and I don't think it really helped move the case forward. Since then, there haven't been many updates. Scott's father died about 10 years ago without any answers to his son's fate. As of spring 2025, a new cold case task force in St. Charles was announced, and one of the top cases mentioned was that of Scott. I really hope his family is able to get some answers soon. Because for now, they're left to wonder, was Scott a victim of another youth offender? Was Michael Devlin the perpetrator? Is it someone we haven't even mentioned in this episode? Whatever the answer is, it's not too late to come forward. Maybe you have information you feel is insignificant. Report it to the proper authorities and let them decide. It's been 37 years and the family has waited long enough. So if you have any information on the disappearance of Scott Kleeschulte, please contact the St. Charles, Missouri Police Department at 1-636-949-3300. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review and share the podcast on your social media platforms and with a friend. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode, and as always, thank you so much for listening.